The experience of black slaves in the southern United States during the era of slavery was marked by a relentless and systematic suppression of fundamental rights. From education to movement, property ownership to religious practices, the institution of slavery imposed oppressive restrictions on every aspect of their lives. In this video, we'll delve into specific measures taken by slaveholders to deny black slaves the basic liberties that many take for granted. These methods were not only legally sanctioned but also deeply ingrained in the societal fabric, creating a comprehensive system of control that perpetuated the dehumanization of the enslaved population. It is also worthwhile for you to know the reason why we're making this video. It is because of the systemic erasure of black history and history in general out from African schools. There's this popular African saying, "When you're ignorant of what killed your father, what killed your father will kill you." So, do us a huge favor to like, share, put your thoughts on this video in the comments section and subscribe to this channel, Black and Powerful. Don't forget to turn on the bell notification for future videos. Thanks for subscribing. Let's continue the video. Learn to read or write. Enslaved individuals faced harsh restrictions on learning to read or write to maintain control. Laws like the 1831 Virginia statute prohibited teaching slaves to read, backed by severe penalties. Slaveholders feared education might foster rebellion, leading to brutal punishments such as beatings and finger amputation. This oppressive environment prevailed across the southern United States, perpetuating the cycle of illiteracy among black slaves. In addition to legal barriers, slave owners implemented covert methods to suppress literacy. Slaves were often prohibited from attending schools or places of learning, creating an environment that denied them access to education. Slave patrols were established to monitor and control the movements of slaves, making it difficult for them to gather for any form of education. Moreover, many plantations went to great lengths to keep slaves ignorant. The fear of knowledge was so pervasive that some slaveholders believed an educated slave would become disobedient and rebellious. As a result, they actively discouraged any intellectual pursuits among their enslaved workforce. The oppressive measures extended to censoring written material. Laws forbade slaves from reading or possessing certain books, newspapers, or any literature that could potentially empower them. This further isolated them from the world of ideas and information. This concerted effort to restrict education left a lasting impact, contributing to a legacy of systemic inequality and educational disparities that persisted long after the abolition of slavery. Gather in groups. To compound the restrictions on education, enslaved individuals were also forbidden from gathering in large groups. This prohibition aimed to thwart any potential for organized resistance or rebellion. Slaveholders feared that collective gatherings could foster unity and the exchange of subversive ideas. Laws explicitly restricted the assembly of slaves, with severe consequences for violators. Punishments ranged from brutal whippings to more extreme forms of physical abuse. The objective was to instill fear and discourage any form of unity among the enslaved population. This prohibition extended beyond formal gatherings, reaching into everyday interactions. The pervasive surveillance by overseers and patrols meant that slaves had to be cautious even in their casual conversations. The fear of repercussions for congregating, discussing ideas, or planning any form of resistance permeated every aspect of enslaved individuals' lives. The combination of restrictions on education and the prevention of organized gatherings worked in tandem to maintain a system of control that sought to keep slaves submissive and ignorant, reinforcing the deeply entrenched power dynamics of the institution of slavery. Additionally, the restriction on large gatherings contributed to the isolation of enslaved individuals, limiting their ability to share experiences and insights. This deliberate separation aimed to prevent the formation of a collective consciousness that could challenge the status quo. Enslaved people often found solace and strength in communal bonds. By stifling these gatherings, slaveholders attempted to disrupt the potential for solidarity and resistance. The fear of punishment for assembling in groups loomed large, discouraging any attempts at building a sense of community among the enslaved. The prohibition on gatherings was enforced through a system of constant surveillance and informants within the slave community. This created an environment of distrust, making it challenging for slaves to confide in one another or plan any form of collective action. In essence, the restrictions on both education and gatherings were integral components of a comprehensive strategy to maintain dominance and control over the enslaved population, perpetuating a system built on fear, ignorance, and isolation. Own property. The denial of property ownership for black slaves was deeply entrenched in the system of slavery. Laws like the Black Codes, established in the southern states, explicitly forbade slaves from owning land or possessions. In places like Louisiana, harsh penalties awaited those who attempted to accumulate property. The oppressive nature of this restriction extended to the point where owning even the simplest possessions could result in severe physical punishment, such as whipping or, in extreme cases, death. The rationale behind this prohibition was rooted in maintaining control. Slaveholders feared that allowing slaves to own property would grant them a level of independence and autonomy that could undermine the very foundation of the slave system. As a result, strict laws were put in place to quash any aspirations of property ownership among the enslaved population. Furthermore, the legal system was often skewed against slaves who sought to assert any rights to property. Courts were inclined to uphold the status quo, reinforcing the notion that slaves were mere property themselves, devoid of any entitlement to land or possessions. This systematic denial of property ownership further entrenched the economic disparities between slaves and their owners, leaving a lasting impact on the socio-economic conditions that persisted long after the abolition of slavery. In states like South Carolina, the slave codes explicitly outlined the prohibition on property ownership for slaves. These codes not only restricted the acquisition of land, but also extended to personal possessions. Slaves were essentially considered property themselves, denying them the legal standing to own anything. Attempts by slaves to accumulate property were met with brutal consequences. The fear of severe physical punishment, such as whipping, served as a powerful deterrent. In some instances, the punishment was so extreme that it could escalate to death, underscoring the severity of the consequences for challenging the established order. Additionally, any semblance of economic autonomy was stifled by the fact that slaves were often subjected to forced labor without compensation. This meant that even if they managed to acquire possessions through means such as trade or barter, the fruits of their labor were not truly their own. The denial of property ownership was not only a legal and economic tactic but also a psychological one. It reinforced the dehumanizing narrative that slaves were mere chattel, devoid of the rights and privileges associated with property ownership. This intentional suppression of economic independence left a lasting legacy of inequality that echoes through the historical trajectory of African Americans in the United States. Travel without permission. The control over the movement of black slaves was a key aspect of the oppressive system. Laws, like those found in the southern states, explicitly restricted slaves from traveling without explicit permission from their owners. In places such as Mississippi and Alabama, strict regulations governed the mobility of slaves. Attempting to escape or travel without the owner's consent carried severe consequences. Punishments included brutal beatings, serving as a powerful deterrent against any form of independent movement. Slave patrols were established to enforce these restrictions, maintaining constant surveillance to prevent unauthorized travel. Anyone caught without proper authorization faced immediate consequences. The fear of punishment often compelled slaves to seek permission even for short journeys, reinforcing the overarching control exerted by the slaveholders. Moreover, the threat of being sold to harsher conditions loomed large for those who dared to defy these travel restrictions. The prospect of being separated from family and familiar surroundings served as an additional layer of psychological coercion, further suppressing any inclination towards independent mobility. In essence, the control over the travel of black slaves was a methodical means of ensuring dominance and quashing any potential for resistance, highlighting the pervasive nature of the oppression within the institution of slavery. In states like Virginia and South Carolina, where slavery was deeply entrenched, laws explicitly outlined the limitations on the movement of slaves. The pass system was introduced, requiring slaves to carry written permission slips when traveling. This pass, often called a slave pass or slave ticket, specified the destination, purpose, and duration of travel, leaving no room for spontaneous or independent movement. The consequences for violating these travel restrictions were severe. The brutal beatings inflicted on those caught without a pass served as a visceral reminder of the consequences of disobedience. In extreme cases, slaveholders were known to resort to whipping or other forms of physical punishment that left lasting scars, both physically and psychologically. The fear of being sold to harsher conditions further underscored the vulnerability of slaves seeking to travel without permission. The threat of separation from loved ones and familiarity added a layer of emotional coercion, emphasizing the high stakes involved in challenging the prescribed boundaries. Enforcement of these travel restrictions extended beyond the plantations. Slave patrols, often comprised of white men tasked with monitoring and controlling the movements of slaves, operated with the authority to stop and interrogate any slave found traveling without a pass. This constant surveillance contributed to an environment of fear and restricted mobility, reinforcing the hierarchical power dynamics of slavery. Defend themselves against whites. The suppression of black slaves' right to defend themselves was a pervasive aspect of the institution of slavery, particularly in the southern United States. Laws, such as the 1740 South Carolina Slave Code, explicitly prohibited slaves from resisting or defending themselves against mistreatment by white individuals. In states like Georgia and Louisiana, where slavery was deeply entrenched, slaves who dared to stand up against any form of abuse faced harsh consequences. The legal system was skewed against them, with courts consistently siding with white slaveholders. The prevailing notion was that slaves were property, not individuals with rights. The severe punishments for self-defense included brutal beatings, whipping, or even death. The fear of retaliation and the overwhelming power dynamic made it exceedingly difficult for slaves to seek justice or protection against violence and mistreatment. Moreover, slave patrols, armed groups tasked with monitoring and controlling the actions of slaves, further enforced this prohibition. Their presence heightened the climate of fear, making it clear that any attempt to resist or defend oneself against a white person, even in the face of cruelty, would be met with severe consequences. This systematic denial of the right to self-defense reinforced the dehumanizing narrative that permeated the institution of slavery, leaving black slaves vulnerable to exploitation and abuse without legal recourse. In Virginia and Alabama, where slavery had deep roots, laws explicitly restricted the ability of black slaves to defend themselves against mistreatment by whites. The legal framework was designed to reinforce the subservient status of slaves, denying them basic human rights. The notion of slave patrols gained prominence in the southern states, including places like Mississippi and Texas. These patrols, consisting of white individuals often deputized to enforce slave codes, maintained a constant presence to ensure compliance. Their primary role was to quash any form of resistance, making it clear that slaves had no right to resist mistreatment, even in self-defense. Furthermore, the legal system upheld this imbalance of power. Courts routinely dismissed cases where slaves sought justice for abuse or violence inflicted by whites. The prevailing sentiment was that slaves were the property of their owners, lacking the agency to defend themselves against any form of maltreatment. This systematic denial of the right to self-defense not only perpetuated physical and emotional abuse but also reinforced the deeply ingrained racial hierarchy. The fear of severe punishment, including the possibility of death, left black slaves in a state of profound vulnerability, unable to protect themselves from the injustices inflicted upon them by white individuals. Marriage without approval. The freedom to marry for black slaves was heavily restricted, particularly in the southern states like South Carolina and Georgia. Slaveholders wielded control over the marital decisions of their slaves, emphasizing that unions required explicit approval. In places like Mississippi and Alabama, laws reinforced this control by not legally recognizing slave marriages unless approved by the master. Slave couples desiring to wed had to seek permission, turning their personal choice into a matter of owner consent. Unsanctioned marriages carried severe consequences. Slaveholders, driven by economic motives, often viewed unions formed without approval as a threat. In instances of unauthorized marriages, the punishment could involve separating or selling one or both partners, perpetuating the disruption of familial bonds. The denial of the right to freely choose a life partner further dehumanized slaves, treating them as property rather than individuals with personal autonomy. This systematic control over marriage was a tool to maintain dominance, emphasizing that even matters of the heart were subject to the will of the slaveholder. In states like Virginia and Louisiana, where slavery was deeply ingrained, laws explicitly regulated the marital choices of black slaves. Marriage without the explicit approval of the master was not only discouraged but often deemed illegal, stripping slaves of the autonomy to form unions based on personal choice. Slaveholders in places like North Carolina and Texas wielded significant power over the marital decisions of their slaves. The economic interests of the slaveholder were often prioritized over the emotional bonds of the enslaved couples. Seeking permission to marry became a necessary and often degrading process, reinforcing the subordinate status of slaves. Unsanctioned marriages faced not only social stigma but also tangible repercussions. The separation or sale of one or both partners was a common response to unions formed without approval. This practice not only devastated the individuals involved but also served as a method of control, instilling fear among the enslaved population and discouraging independent choices. Moreover, the denial of legal recognition for slave marriages meant that even if couples managed to form unions, they lacked the legal protections afforded to free individuals. This further reinforced the vulnerability of black slaves, leaving them without legal recourse to protect their familial relationships. The systematic control over marriage highlighted the pervasive dehumanization within the institution of slavery, where personal choices, even in matters of love and family, were subject to the whims and interests of the slaveholders. Practice religion independently. In the context of practicing religion independently, black slaves faced significant restrictions, particularly in states like South Carolina and Alabama. Slaveholders tightly controlled religious activities, compelling slaves to attend services led by white preachers. In Georgia and Mississippi, laws explicitly prohibited independent religious gatherings among slaves. The objective was to prevent the formation of a distinct religious identity that could potentially foster unity and resistance. Any violation of this rule carried severe consequences, with punishments such as whipping being a common form of retribution. Slaveholders were wary of the potential for independent religious gatherings to serve as a catalyst for rebellion. In places like Louisiana and Texas, where slavery was deeply entrenched, the suppression of independent religious practices was a means of maintaining control and preventing any form of collective empowerment among the enslaved population. The forced attendance at services led by white preachers also served a dual purpose. It reinforced the subjugation of slaves by promoting a version of Christianity that emphasized obedience and submission. This control over religious practices further extended the dominion of slaveholders into the spiritual lives of black slaves, underscoring the comprehensive nature of oppression within the institution of slavery. In Virginia and North Carolina, where slavery was deeply embedded, strict regulations governed the religious practices of black slaves. Independent gatherings for religious worship were actively prohibited, and slaves were compelled to attend services led by white preachers, often adhering to a version of Christianity tailored to reinforce obedience. The prohibition of independent religious practices aimed to suppress the potential for collective empowerment among enslaved individuals. Slaveholders in places like Maryland and Kentucky were particularly concerned about the role of religion in fostering a sense of community and resistance. Any attempt to organize religious meetings outside the control of white preachers was met with swift and harsh repercussions. Punishments for violating this rule extended beyond mere reprimands. Whipping, a form of physical punishment, was a common consequence for those caught participating in unauthorized religious gatherings. The fear of such punitive measures served as a powerful deterrent, further restricting the religious freedom of black slaves. Moreover, The selective interpretation and presentation of Christianity reinforced the hierarchical structure of slavery. White preachers often emphasized passages that promoted submission and obedience, while ignoring or downplaying elements that spoke of equality or liberation. This manipulation of religious teachings became a tool of control, ingraining a sense of inferiority among the enslaved population. The suppression of independent religious practices became not only a means of control but also a method of shaping the ideological landscape, perpetuating the dehumanization inherent in the institution of slavery. Testify against whites in court. The prohibition on black slaves testifying against whites in court was a deeply ingrained aspect of the legal system, particularly in states like South Carolina and Mississippi. Legal restrictions explicitly barred slaves from offering testimony in legal proceedings, irrespective of the nature of the case. In Alabama and Louisiana, where slavery was deeply entrenched, the systemic denial of the right to testify reinforced the subordinate status of black slaves. Regardless of whether they were witnesses to a crime or victims of wrongdoing, slaves were rendered voiceless in the legal arena. Attempts by slaves to testify against whites often resulted in severe consequences. In places like Georgia and Texas, the legal system was skewed to protect the interests of whites. Slaveholders wielded significant influence, and any defiance of this societal norm could lead to physical punishment, such as whipping or other forms of retribution. This systematic denial of the right to testify not only undermined the pursuit of justice but also perpetuated a climate of fear and silence among the enslaved population. It exemplified the pervasive dehumanization within the institution of slavery, where even the most basic legal rights were systematically denied based on racial hierarchy. In Virginia and Kentucky, where slavery was deeply entrenched, laws explicitly restricted the ability of black slaves to testify against whites in court. This legal limitation perpetuated a deeply unjust system where the rights of enslaved individuals were systematically undermined. The prohibition on testifying against whites not only denied slaves the opportunity to seek justice but also reinforced a culture of impunity for those who committed crimes against them. In cases of abuse, violence, or crimes perpetrated by whites against slaves, the legal system in Mississippi and North Carolina was designed to shield the wrongdoers rather than provide redress for the victims. Moreover, the denial of testimony extended to cases where black individuals were witnesses to events involving whites. This not only silenced the voices of the oppressed but also created an environment where accountability was elusive, fostering a culture of unchecked power and abuse. In instances where slaves attempted to defy these restrictions, they faced severe consequences. The threat of physical punishment, such as whipping, served as a powerful deterrent, ensuring that slaves remained silent in the face of injustice. The legal system, rather than serving as a mechanism for fairness and impartiality, became a tool to perpetuate the systemic oppression embedded in the institution of slavery. Runaway. Efforts to escape slavery were met with harsh repercussions, particularly in states like Alabama and Georgia. Laws and regulations explicitly targeted runaway slaves, implementing brutal measures to prevent escape. In South Carolina and Mississippi, severe consequences awaited those attempting to break free from bondage. Punishments, such as whipping, branding, or even more brutal forms of torture, were inflicted upon captured runaway slaves. This not only served as punishment for the individual attempting escape but also as a deterrent to others who might contemplate fleeing. The systematic brutality to suppress runaway attempts extended to other southern states like Louisiana and Texas. Slave patrols, consisting of white individuals tasked with capturing runaways, operated with the authority to mete out punishments. This pervasive surveillance further intensified the risks associated with attempting to gain freedom. The threat of physical harm, combined with the risk of being sold to harsher conditions upon capture, created a climate of fear that permeated the enslaved population. This systematic suppression of escape attempts reinforced the power dynamics of slavery, leaving enslaved individuals with limited options for resisting their oppressive circumstances. In Virginia and North Carolina, where the institution of slavery was deeply entrenched, laws were enacted to systematically discourage and punish attempts to escape. The penalties for running away extended beyond immediate physical harm, contributing to a climate of perpetual fear and surveillance. Runaway slaves often faced not only whipping and branding but also more sadistic forms of punishment. In Mississippi and Kentucky, for instance, some slaveholders employed slave breakers, who specialized in brutal methods to break the spirit of those attempting escape. These methods included public beatings, forced labor under especially harsh conditions, or even mutilation. The psychological impact was profound. The fear of severe consequences, coupled with the knowledge that captured runaways could face more brutal conditions upon return, created a formidable barrier to escape. In states like Maryland and Tennessee, the relentless pursuit of runaway slaves by slave patrols, armed groups with the authority to apprehend and punish, further heightened the risks associated with seeking freedom. The restrictions on escape weren't just legal. They were deeply ingrained in the societal norms of the time. A culture of surveillance, informants, and a pervasive sense of helplessness contributed to the overall suppression of resistance. This orchestrated system worked to maintain the enslaved population in a state of subjugation, where the pursuit of freedom came with extraordinarily high personal costs. Refuse to work. The obligation to work under challenging conditions was a defining feature of slavery, notably in places like South Carolina and Alabama. Laws and societal norms dictated that slaves had no choice but to work, and any refusal or resistance was met with severe consequences. In Georgia and Mississippi, where slavery was deeply ingrained, the consequences for refusing to work were brutal. Slaveholders had the authority to inflict physical punishment, often resorting to whipping as a means of discipline. This not only served as a form of retribution for the individual refusing to work but also as a deterrent to others who might contemplate similar resistance. The threat of being sold to a more punitive owner loomed large for those who resisted work. In Louisiana and Texas, the prospect of being separated from family and familiar surroundings was a powerful tool of coercion. This heightened the fear associated with any act of defiance, making the consequences of refusing to work not only personal but also a potential source of collective trauma. The systematic suppression of any resistance to work, whether through legal measures or through the physical and psychological repercussions imposed by slaveholders, maintained a coercive environment that reinforced the subjugation of the enslaved population. In Virginia and North Carolina, where slavery was deeply entrenched, the obligation for slaves to work was enforced through a combination of legal structures and ruthless practices. The legal system in these states explicitly upheld the authority of slaveholders to compel labor from their slaves, creating a framework that facilitated harsh consequences for those who resisted. Slaveholders, particularly in Maryland and Tennessee, were known to employ overseers who often used brutal methods to enforce work compliance. The threat of physical punishment, such as whipping, was a constant presence on plantations and in the fields. This not only inflicted immediate pain but also served as a visible means of control, reinforcing the power dynamics between slaves and their owners. In instances of persistent resistance to work, the specter of being sold to a more punitive owner became a chilling prospect. This threat, prevalent in Kentucky and Mississippi, was a powerful tool of coercion, striking at the very core of familial bonds and stability. The fear of separation from loved ones and being thrust into even harsher conditions served as a potent deterrent against any act of defiance. The suppression of the right to refuse work permeated every aspect of the enslaved individual's life, shaping their daily experiences and perpetuating a cycle of submission and oppression. The systemic enforcement of labor contributed to the dehumanization inherent in slavery, emphasizing control over personal autonomy and the harsh consequences for those who dared to resist. The detailed exploration of restrictions on education, gatherings, property ownership, travel, self-defense, marriage, religion, legal testimony, running away, and refusal to work reveals a chilling narrative of systemic oppression. These measures were meticulously designed to strip black slaves of autonomy, freedom, and dignity. The enduring legacy of these injustices is evident in the long-lasting socioeconomic disparities and systemic inequalities that persisted well beyond the abolition of slavery. Understanding these historical injustices is essential for grappling with the complex legacy of slavery and working towards a more just and equitable society. Thanks for watching.